Years of poverty compounded by years of violence, and now the worst drought in more than half a century. All this has conspired to create the worst food crisis for Somalia in decades. These are scenes in the capital, Mogadishu, a city of 1.5 million people, now forced to accommodate many, many more. Others have crossed borders in the hope of a better life. What awaits them in reality are squalid and ever-expanding refugee camps. The UN is demanding action.
Across Somalia, nearly half of the population, 3.7 million people, are now in crisis. And an estimated 2.8 million of these people are in the south. This will have an increasingly devastating effect, not just in Somalia, but on other countries in the region.
Well, that warning from Ban Ki-moon is reinforced when you look at the sheer numbers of people thought to be affected by drought across the Horn of Africa. And we've got a bit of an overview for you here. The UN's humanitarian arm says more than 4.5 million Ethiopians lack food security due to unrelenting dry weather. 3 million are at risk of going hungry in neighbouring Kenya. But Somalia is giving the gravest cause for concern. 3.7 million people, about half the population there, need more food. And the drought is causing mass migration as well. A quarter of the country's population is now displaced. The experts say conditions in Somalia are the worst conditions on the continent. Well, right here, and it's down there on the map, I can tell you these are in between the regions of Bakul and Lower Shabelle. The UN on Wednesday declared a famine. Now, the immediate effects of famine are devastating and well documented, but the long-term economic implications for Somalia are also severe. Malnutrition isn't just a short-term illness. It can impede healthy development and restrict people's education and employability. Then there's another factor that I just touched on, migration, which causes social disruption, and that also affects education. But perhaps the greatest economic threat is the threat to livestock. If animals die, Somalis are robbed of their most valuable possessions, they're unable to trade, and their poverty just deepens. Well, all of those factors could impact Somalia's future. Right here in the present, there are huge obstacles facing people who are trying to help. Aid and trade to the country have been hampered by political instability. Humanitarian workers have been threatened and killed. The World Food Programme says it's lost 14 relief workers in that region since 2008. Whole areas of the country have been shut off, and insurgents are only now letting foreigners in, but the danger remains. So let's go live to Patrick Raleigh from the Economist Intelligence Unit. He's in London. Let's talk about these economic implications because they are really widespread. I mean, where do we begin? How do you fix something like this from an economic point of view?
Well, Somalia certainly has an awful lot of problems, and these go back for many, many years now. You touched on some in your introduction, and these include the civil conflict, which has been going on now for a generation. This has led to a total failure of investment in infrastructure and also in humanitarian distribution networks. So Somalia, certainly for the short and medium term, is in a serious economic crisis.
Patrick, people of our generation remember things like Live Aid. This debate about whether trade or aid works goes on. In this case, it does seem like a massive failure. You've used that word, but we can't allow that to continue. Something has to change. What do you think of the things that David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, was saying when he was in Africa just a few days ago?
I think David Cameron's comments about the importance of trade are absolutely spot on. I think, though, we do need to distinguish between humanitarian emergency aid and development aid. In this situation, there's no doubt that a lot of humanitarian aid is needed to help people who are in acute crisis. Over the long term, though, the role of aid is very much contested in the development literature, and trade is certainly a more sustainable model for development. However, Somalia's key problem is a lack of a functioning national government. There is an administration in Mogadishu that claims to be a national government, but it really only controls a small part of the capital, Mogadishu, and the rest of the country. So really, I mean, economics will follow once the peace has been secured and once the politics has been got right. And then we can talk about trade.
Well, I was going to
Yeah.
say, you can absolutely send emergency humanitarian aid that way, but who do you send it to? Not to mention, of course, the fact that you've had this massive migration. A quarter of the population, you've got people heading to refugee camps, and this on the border with Kenya, and the local population are not happy about it. And then you have the economic impact of that tussle between the two communities.
This is true. Kenya has, borne the brunt here of Somali refugees. We've heard that the Dadaab refugee camp across the border is, it's got about 380,000 people, expecting to hit 500,000 quite soon. That makes it a sizable city, in effect, run by aid agencies. Somalis are willing to brave a long migration on foot often to get to these camps, even though they're often unsanitary and insecure, because it's seen as the least bad option for them. You're very right that there are tensions with both the Kenyan authorities and local Kenyans who see the Somalis coming in. There's competition now for resources. And there's also suspicion that Somali criminal networks are infiltrating Nairobi and elsewhere in the country, trying to launder money from piracy, etc. So, yeah, these tensions are also political and economic risks in the future.
Okay, lots to talk about. Patrick Raleigh of the Economist Intelligence Unit, thank you for that. And all of you out there, just look at CNN.com if you want to get more. Thank you on that story. So important, Maggie, for all of us to be educated about what's happening.